Thank you. Okay. In the second session, we have 3 technical papers, and each presenter will have 15 minutes of the presentation and 5 minutes of the question and comment. And we are starting a little bit late, 5 minutes. So we hopefully finish, in time. So let me introduce, the first paper. You see that it is kind of a very important topic, right? So about the Ethereum's future. So even the first author is kind of founder. And today we have the presenter Daniel. Yeah, please go ahead and introduce yourself about the topic. Sure. Okay.
Thanks. Yes, thank you. So indeed, my name is Daniel, and this is joint work with my SUTD colleagues, Stefanos Leonardos and Yorgos Poliouras, and of course with Ethereum co-founder Vitalik Buterin. So I'll be talking today about the Casper protocol, which is the proof-of-stake protocol that's being developed by Ethereum. And in its final stage, Casper will consist of several parts. One of its parts is the friendly finality gadget. And I'll be talking about this gadget in a hybrid context. So by hybrid, I mean that the gadget itself is proof of stake, but it will be overlaid onto something else. In this case, proof of work blockchain. And I'll specifically talk a bit about the incentives, so the rewards and penalties that people can get for participating in the protocol. And as we will see, these incentives actually have an impact on the core properties of the protocol, like liveness and safety. So I'll start with some background. So yeah, well, we all know Bitcoin was the first blockchain platform. In Bitcoin, the data that is put on the blockchain are token transfers. So one person sending money to another person. And Ethereum took this one step further. So in Ethereum, you can still do token transfers, but you can also do, you can upload code onto the blockchain and then execute it. These pieces of code on the blockchain are called smart contracts. And well, hopefully most of you will know about them. So since then, Ethereum has grown. It's still the biggest smart contract platform that's available publicly, and the second biggest cryptocurrency actually in terms of market value. It depends a bit on time, it fluctuates, but there's at least 8,000 full nodes active. And for the past year, every day, on average, 600,000 transactions were processed by the Ethereum network. So, like I said, Ethereum used ideas from Bitcoin. It made some modifications, but its consensus protocol still took 2 key concepts from Bitcoin: proof of work and longest chain rule. And because I need them later, so I'll just make sure we're clear about what they mean. So proof of work, as we all know, if you want to propose a block in Bitcoin or Ethereum at the moment, what you need to do is acquire computational power. What you will then do is use this power to try to solve these puzzles. Once you find a solution to a puzzle, you can propose a block and send it across the network. Of course, this costs energy, so block proposers are rewarded. It's called mining by tokens. But of course, this costs a lot of electricity. So the whole Bitcoin network together, for example, consumes as much electricity as a small country, medium-sized country almost. That's one thing that we can improve on. Of course, due to the random nature of finding solutions to these puzzles, what can happen is that when somebody finds a block and it's being propagated across the peer-to-peer network, that somebody else finds also a block. And what you get then is a period of disagreement between the parts of the network. This is called a fork. This might actually persist for some time if there's like a network partition. So imagine that for like an hour, all miners in the US are disconnected from the rest of the world. Then what you get is that basically 2 different blockchains are being built separately. But at some point this can be resolved due to this longest chain rule. So when this hijacking attack, for example, is over, the network is not partitioned anymore. Everybody can become aware of all the branches that are available. Then nodes will pick the longest branch, basically, with some, it's roughly. So what you will get, for example, is if there's 2 branches, one with 3 and one with 4 blocks since the fork, that everybody will just pick the one with the 4 blocks, and then the network can reach consensus again. This is vulnerable to attacks, specifically a 51% attack. So if actually malicious agents control more than 50% of the mining power, they can basically partition the network at will, simply by separating their nodes from the network. And what they can do then is create their own chain, and at any point broadcast this chain to the rest of the network, and then overturn the blocks that the other people have been mining, which of course is an inconvenience if your transaction appeared in one of these other nodes. So this is bad, but again, this is what this is what we are trying to prevent. So compared to proof of work, one of the alternatives is proof of stake. It depends a bit on how you define it, but in this definition, what you do is you take tokens, you lock them in a deposit, and then we have a fixed set of deposit holders or stakeholders. We call them validators. And what happens at every round, for example, is that blocks can be chosen by each of these deposit holders, and this is done in some pseudo-random fashion. This has some challenges. Because blocks are now not hard to create anymore, there's no disincentive to create several at the same time. So for example, if there's a fork in the network, what somebody could just do is, well, instead of choosing, why not extend both, right? So this is an issue, that maybe forks are not as resolved as easily as possible as they were previously. Another thing is long-range attacks. So what you could do is, let's say you go back 4 years into the past, and you can get access to the private keys of people who held a majority at this point. What you can then do is just rebuild the entire chain, 4 years worth of chain, without too much cost, not the cost of having to do all this mining. And yeah, it will be difficult for nodes to actually choose which is the correct branch in this setting. So this is also an issue with proof of stake. And then, of course, we have some other things like how to choose incentives. Do we keep the same structure of mining rewards as we did previously? And how to preserve liveness. So, for example, in Bitcoin, if some nodes go offline, well, every 2 weeks there's a difficulty reset. In proof of stake, you need something similar. So if people go offline, you need to be able, the network needs to be able to recover, basically. Yes, so, okay, moving on, yes. So it has been Ethereum's goal for some time to move from its current proof of work setting to proof of stake. The protocol that's being developed is called Casper. But instead of just moving from proof of work to proof of stake in one big go, there will probably be a hybrid phase where proof of work and proof of stake coexist. And in particular, this friendly finality gadget can be used as a proof of stake part, as an overlay on top of this proof of work part. And then it performs checkpointing. And I'll explain that later. But yeah, so in this talk I'll focus on the incentives mechanism, so the rewards. I'll talk about liveness and safety. And I just want to emphasize that although I'm focusing at the moment on Ethereum and on its current proof of work blockchain, it's important to know that it can be applied onto anything. Actually, it might be even better to apply it to proof of stake block proposal mechanisms. So it's quite general. Right. So like I said, we assume that the blocks are being proposed using proof of work. So the chain is just growing, and there can be partitions. But every sequence of several blocks, for example. Okay, so this is, okay, hopefully you can hear me better now. All right, so yeah, so like I said, blocks are being proposed in the network. And then every sequence of 50 blocks, for example, we call this an epoch. And the first block in every epoch is called a checkpoint. What we then do is that validators can vote for which checkpoint they think should be the real one. So for example, if you have the setting below, where the network is partitioned, then some validators will probably be aware of the branch on the top, and others of the branch on the bottom. What they do during each epoch is vote for the ones they think is the real one. So for the checkpoint on the left, everyone will agree. But for the 2 checkpoints on the right, maybe like 40% will vote for one and 60% vote for the other. That can happen. Yes, and if 2/3 of all the validators agree on one checkpoint, then we call it justified. And if 2 consecutive checkpoints are justified, we say that the first one is finalized. And especially finalized will have some implications for the fork choice rule. Yes, so if a block is finalized, then nodes will not overturn it. And this is actually a quite strong property, because at the moment, of course, in proof of work, you don't really have such a guarantee. In Bitcoin, there's sort of a rule of thumb that if a block has 6 confirmations,
that it's sort of safe to assume that it will not be overturned. But this is only during normal network conditions. During a 51% attack or a network partition, you cannot be sure that this is the case. Yeah. So actually, recently, a couple of months ago, we saw that Ethereum Classic, one of the blockchain platforms that uses proof of work, was subjected to such a 51% attack. And over 100 blocks were overturned in one go. So 51% attack is actually a serious risk for smaller proof of work cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin itself is probably pretty safe, but the smaller ones like Litecoin or Dogecoin, not necessarily so. So in Ethereum, if you would have 50 blocks, well, with 14 seconds per block, one epoch would take like 12 minutes. And what you would then get is that the average time to finality is like 25 minutes, which is actually quite good. So once it's finalized, you know that something really dramatic would need to happen to overturn this, and this gives you more security. And as a very strong positive point, long-range attacks are now really hard to perform, because even if you can go back to 4 years back, rebuild the entire chain from then on, every node that will have seen a checkpoint in the meantime will not jump onto your branch. So these 51% long-range attacks are now much harder to perform, basically. Right, so instead of just mining, you now have additional network participants, the validators. Because they, to be able to know which branch to vote for, they need to basically run a full node. That is costly, so they need to be rewarded. So what we do is that if a validator casts a valid vote, so for in the end, the right checkpoint, then they get a reward, which is just their deposit multiplied by some interest rate. So if the VI is the deposit of validator V at epoch I, then at every epoch it hopefully gets multiplied by some constant interest rate. Of course, if they don't vote, if they're offline, or if they're voting for the wrong checkpoint, so something on a different branch, then they don't get rewarded. Instead, they lose a bit. So not too much. They just lose what they would normally gain. If not everybody is voting, then it becomes a little bit different. So to disincentivize censorship, if like 10% of all validators are not voting, then everybody else also gets fewer rewards. Whereas the losses are also a bit bigger. So that way, it doesn't pay off to censor people like it does in Bitcoin. Because in Bitcoin, if like 10% of the people don't vote anymore, there's a difficulty rescale, then you get more, basically. That's the principle behind selfish mining. Here, censorship is disincentivized. If the number of people not voting actually becomes too large, so if it's over 1/3, you cannot justify your finalized checkpoints anymore. What happens then is that nobody gets rewards anymore. So even the people voting, their deposit will basically remain constant. Whereas the non-voting validators get penalized in an increasingly harsh fashion. So this rho I, basically the interest rate, it starts to increase. The voting validators don't get anything, but the non-voting validators get increasingly harsh penalties. I'll explain why that is. It's to preserve liveness, because imagine that 40% of all the nodes go offline. You cannot finalize any checkpoints anymore. So now you basically just have to wait for the voting validators to become a supermajority, to get 2/3 of the vote. But of course, the changes in deposits are not that drastic normally. So I think Ethereum is aiming for like 3 to 5% interest per year. So to actually go from 60% to 67%, normally it would take like a very long time. Maybe a year or something, or years. So that's why this penalty mechanism makes sure that after a month, the penalties are so harsh that the non-voting validators will have their deposits shrink rapidly. And that's how you resume, how liveness is resumed. Because if the voting validators stay the same, but the non-voting validators shrink, then at some point the voting validators will become the majority again. And that's what, so the graph at the bottom indicates is basically the number of epochs that it takes to recover from a fraction alpha of the validators going offline. So even if half of all validators go offline permanently, because I don't know, the FBI takes their computers or whatever, then even then it would take like 2,500 epochs, which is roughly 3 to 4 weeks, I think. So that's okay. I mean, it's still not good, but it allows you to recover from these kind of catastrophic crashes. And the graph that I drew here is just based on one parameter setting. You can basically choose the parameters any way you like. So if you don't think this is fast enough, then you can make the penalties simply more harsh, and then you will recover quicker. Yes, so the other core property, of course, is safety. So safety is violated, of course, when two conflicting checkpoints get finalized. At that point, you have basically permanent disagreement, because nodes don't overturn finalized checkpoints. Well, if two people consider two different nodes blocks as finalized, then yeah, somebody will need to manually reset. So the first way in which this could happen is that that validators are simply casting two votes for conflicting checkpoints. But this is already part of the protocol. So there's a previous paper about this. Basically, if a single validator is voting for two conflicting checkpoints, then you can punish them. Basically, everybody else can broadcast a message across the network saying, this guy broke the rules. Just give the signatures of the offending validator, and then this validator can get slashed. And the person finding it will get a finder's fee to incentivize them to actually report misbehavior. And you can prove that for two conflicting checkpoints to be finalized, you would need at least 1/3 of all validators to break the rules. And that, of course, is a major, performing such an attack will cost you a lot of money, because you can slash like 1/3 of all deposits. So what we did in this paper was consider whether the liveness mechanism can have negative consequences for safety. So I'll explain what can happen. So imagine you have this catastrophic network partitioning again. So at some point, the network forks. 40% of all validators are on one branch, and 60% of the other validators are on the other branch. So at some point, from the point of view of the 60% who are on that branch, they don't know if the other 40% have gone offline or if they are on another branch. So on this branch, the liveness mechanism will ensure that at some point, these 60% become the majority again. So that's what happened over there. At this point, these blocks are finalized again. But the same thing is true on the other branch. It will take some time longer, but at some point, the 40% will have become the majority on this branch. And what you get now is that these two checkpoints are in conflict. Both are finalized, and nobody broke the rules, because everybody was just voting for what they thought was their valid branch. So this could be a safety risk, but as we showed with our simulations, you would need quite a catastrophic crash for this to ever happen. Basically, the partition, the moment until this happens, until the first minority branch gets finalized, that will take at least 20 days or 3 weeks, which is, of course, a very long time. That's unprecedented in internet history for something to happen like this. Even for an attacker. So assume even that an attacker controls 49% of the stake. The attacker can, of course, branch off at will. But still, the 51% branch will be finalized first. And there will still be a window where all the other nodes can learn of this finalized checkpoint. And during this window, if they see the majority branch's finalized block, then they will never turn over to the attacker's branch, meaning that the attacker's branch will never be accepted. So safety is in theory not always guaranteed, but in practice, yes. Right. So I'll say a bit about how to actually implement this. So far I've been talking about, this protocol, how it works. But to implement this, the Ethereum development team started to develop a smart contract for this. So this is actually quite ingenious, because you now have a smart contract, which is on the blockchain like any other contract. But it actually has an impact on the protocol rules. So what happens in this case is that this contract is taken into account in the client. The client will have this address hard-coded, and to execute the protocol, they just query this contract. The contract was written in Viper, which is not Solidity, which is a Python-based smart contract language in Ethereum. And the deposits are just variables. So to make a deposit, what you do is you call the deposit function, send some ether to the contract, and then your deposit just exists as some variable in the contract. And then all the protocol messages, so vote, but also slash, and then withdraw and deposit are all contract calls. So they're just functions inside the contract. To fund this, you would need a hard fork. Well, you need a hard fork anyway for the clients to start taking this into account. But also you would, basically the contract gets instantiated with like 1.5 million ETH created out of nowhere. To compensate for this, the mining rewards would go down so that you still have the same issuance. And basically that would keep the contract funded for some time. Because of course, people earning interest need to be able to take this interest out. And once the contract runs out of money, you would need to hard fork again. But that's again similar to what's happening at the moment. Because every 2 years, I think, like in Bitcoin, the halving is actually hard-coded into the protocol. I think in Ethereum, these kind of halvings are typically hard forked. Right. So this contract, you could argue that this maybe is not. I mean, the EVM is not optimized for this kind of thing. So every vote by itself is a contract call. Maybe that's not very efficient because the cost was found to be non-negligible. Even if you have only 100 validators voting every epoch, then the load is quite high, so about 18% of the total capacity. Of course, you can increase the size of blocks, or but in the end, this is not supposed to be like the final version of the contract of the protocol anyway. Even if you would go ahead with this, it would just be a first step towards proof of stake. So by doing this, you can sort of already create a base of validators. See if that's sort of distributed in a good manner. But this is, of course, not the final stage. But in any case, the contract was shelved with the idea of moving the protocol messages off-chain. So we're not going to consider it just as any other smart contract anymore. There will be a dedicated chain for protocol messages. So there are two reasons for this. First, of course, because then you can do optimizations. But the second is that Ethereum wants to implement sharding. I think it's been discussed before. So in sharding, instead of one blockchain, you have like 100 or 1,000 parallel chains. Then there still needs to be one central chain connecting all these other chains. And now what you can do is the two different development teams were basically solving the same problem. So both want to create this new chain, the central chain or the Casper chain. And why not just merge them together? So what will happen in the end is that, this it's called the beacon chain. This central chain will run the friendly finality gadget, but also do these what's called cross-links, where the beacon chain, you create links of the shard chains to the beacon chain, basically. And this is done on the same chain. So actually, a couple of days ago, a testnet was launched by Prismatic Labs. Because this beacon chain will actually not just run the friendly finality gadget, it will also feature a completely proof-of-stake block proposal mechanism. So that's also interesting, and there already is proof of concept code that's now being tested. So the timeline at the moment seems to be that hopefully by the end of the year everything is running, at least this beacon chain. And then of course the transition towards full sharding, full proof of stake, that will take some more time, but this will hopefully in a matter of years, rather than, so yes. Okay, so to conclude, so I've discussed this friendly finality gadget. It's a checkpointing protocol. So by checkpointing, you create extra safety that, against long-range attacks, against 51% attacks. And to emphasize, it's not just Ethereum that can implement this. Even your smaller proof-of-work cryptocurrency that's fearful of 51% attacks can run this to have a formalized checkpointing mechanism. It has been implemented, so again, that's not an issue. You can, but the lesson learned is that it's better to do this in a sort of optimized way, especially if you want to support a high number of validators, which of course is good for decentralization. And development is ongoing, but in the end, there will be a fully proof-of-stake Casper. And but in this fully proof-of-stake Casper, the design philosophy and incentive structure will be carried over. So yes. Okay. So that concludes my talk.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, you know.
Hi, I'm just curious. So in Casper, what if, let's say, a minority of malicious validators DDoS a majority of honest validators, and then prevent them, and then basically force their stake to leak until the minority of malicious validators becomes the majority? Like,
Yeah. Again, they would need to keep that up for a very long time for it to be profitable.
yeah, it's just that I feel like it's a little. Is it dangerous that basically the leaking mechanism can convert attacks on liveness to attacks on safety?
Again, when I say that these penalties become increasingly fast, still, like, even if you manage to perform a denial of service attack on somebody for a whole day, then still it goes quadratically quickly, and still after a whole day you can hurt them a bit, but not fundamentally so. You really need to DDoS somebody for a very long time to be able to for it to have a major impact on the network.
So basically, this does not completely get rid of a synchronous network assumption. It's more resilient to it than proof of work, but then not completely. I get it.
Sure, I agree.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You had the.
Yeah, thank you for this great talk. So I was wondering, how do you make assumptions on the network? For example, how many nodes are going to be validating, or how to estimate a fork is going to get unrealistically long, or so on.
So sorry, do you mean by nodes, or you mean the validators? Or
yes.
Okay,
And
so, well,
do you
that's
run
it.
simulations, or?
Well, in the implementation, we could, so basically the cost of every function, the Viper compiler produces estimates. So you can sort of see how much it costs. And based on that, based on, you know, how much information you can put in a block, that's where this 80% comes from. And that's 400 validators. So if you would have 200 validators, well, it increases. So in this setting, you would only have like a couple of hundred validators. Ideally, when all these optimizations are possible, then you would go to a much higher number. And so at the moment, so for example, in the contract, the minimum deposit was fixed to be 1,500 Ether, so which is quite a lot. So that's like hundreds of thousands of dollars. But in the next, what Ethereum is planning now is to have only a minimum of 32 ETH, which is much lower. So then you would get a much higher number of validators. But again, this is only possible if you have a well-running beacon chain that can handle this kind of network load.
Okay. Can you? Yeah, you go ahead first. Him.
Hey, so with this additional finalization layer, do you envision the rest of the network to go on as is, or would you think that you might reduce the complexity of the proof of work to increase performance?
Right. Okay. Good question. I mean, of course, to fund the contract, the mining rewards will go down. Maybe pushing some people out of the market because it's just not reasonable for them anymore. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it would decrease a bit, but at least, well, the miners still do have power. I mean, once something is finalized, they cannot go back beyond it, but that only takes it will take at least 100 blocks or something. So they still have some power in that sense. And I think during this hybrid phase, there will still be a very large amount of miners, but it might be reduced. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. You're the last.
My question is very relevant. And I've been working with Ethereum since 2013.
Okay.
The way it's described, it will still be a mining blockchain. It will still be a mining blockchain, and you just have the proof of stake as an add-on, right?
Yes. So
the way that, as a third party is looking at that, is that you don't trust the proof of stake. and you still use the mining to be able to maintain the network, and you're just sandboxing the proof of stake so you can refine it in the future.
Yes.
So essentially, this is I mean, this is not a negative. I'm just saying, is it like a safe approach towards?
Yes, I agree. Because when I say that the contract is easy to implement in the client, it's also easy to revert. Because if something goes wrong, all you have to do in the client is turn this feature off, and you're basically back to where you were. So indeed, it's safer, like you said. So I agree. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, give him a big applause. Yeah. Okay. We still have we don't have enough time. We are supposed to finish in 12:30. Okay, so let's have our second presentation. Jonathan, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. I guess I'll just introduce myself. So my name is Jonathan Joggenfors, and I am a security researcher and a postdoctoral researcher at Linköping University in Sweden. And my background is in information security, but also quantum cryptography, quantum key distribution, and quantum hacking. I want to present a paper today where we use quantum mechanics to make Bitcoin better. Well, that's the general idea. And I'm fully aware with this short time, I won't be able to go into all the details, so I'll refer you to the paper for further details. But I'll try to explain the background of quantum mechanics and quantum non-cloning and why this is important. Basically, quantum physics gives us the mother of all copy protection systems. In quantum physics, we cannot take a quantum system or quantum state and copy it. That's impossible. It's quite neat. We can use this to make quantum money. Even in 1969, before quantum encryption was ever available, a guy named Stefan Wiesner envisioned quantum banknotes. A banknote with a number of quantum photons, quantum states here, in different polarizations, for instance. Since you cannot copy them, a bank can create these types of banknotes in a secret configuration and then a classical serial number to make unforgeable banknotes. And this is called private key quantum money. Only the bank can create this money, and only the bank can actually verify that the bill is correct. For instance, if you and I were to measure these photons, we would just guess which orientation to put the polarizers in, which would destroy the banknote. And if you have n quantum states, in this case we have 20, the probability of forging will be 3/4 to the power of n, so exponential small probability of forgery given the number of photons. For instance, here we have 0.3% since we have 20 quantum states. All right, that's quantum money. The first question I often get when I talk about quantum money is, hey, doesn't a measurement destroy a quantum bill? And it's actually correct. You will impact a quantum system when you measure a quantum system. But the good thing is we can actually reconstruct the bills with a very high probability. So even if the quantum system is measured, Aronson and Christiana show that we can reconstruct it with a very high probability. A more serious problem, and this is because we don't have quantum computers today, these builds will basically only last for a few microseconds with our current technology, which is a bit of a drawback, I'll admit it. But let's assume this will work, and maybe in the future we can use these quantum money systems. So in theory, even with quantum computers, we still write quantum algorithms even though the quantum computer is still not available. I mentioned that this first type of quantum money was private key, which means that only the bank can verify that the money is correct. This is quite useless for cash and money, so instead we have something called public key quantum money, which is a more recent development. Here, anyone can verify that the money is correct. And the state of the art currently of this research, and this theoretical research, is black box security. So we can refer to black box oracles, and relative to them, we can show that these money systems are safe. There are some explicit methods to implement these oracles, but the security of these is still broken and or unknown. So this is still an open problem for the continued research into this field. The first explicit method I want to mention is by Fari in 2010, which uses knot theory to create quantum bills. You see these knots here in the quantum state. And the other system, which we'll be basing on today, is by Aronson and Christiana from 2012, which uses subspaces of linear codes and projections onto dual spaces to make these systems work. Okay, so we'll define a full quantum banknote as the following. So this is the dollar sign here with the classical serial number, basically just bits, then a quantum state, and then we sign the serial number using a private key. And I apologize for the little different notation here. This is the notation we use in quantum money. So what we have here is the quantum state, and how do we transfer a quantum bill? Well, you have to transfer it physically. Let's imagine a vacuum flask or a cryogenic bottle that stores this quantum state, and I'll give it to you physically. Or when we have a quantum internet, we can send these quantum states over this quantum network. So quantum Bitcoin will be slightly different from normal Bitcoin in that you will need a quantum internet to transfer. And a very high-level description of how we verify these bills is that we have a bill on this form again, and then we check that the serial number matches the quantum state in some way. I won't go into much details about this, but there's more information in the paper. And then that this last part, this digital signature, is valid signature of the serial number S. So the quantum state matches the serial number, and then we have a signature of the serial number 2. I also want to mention something called mini-schemes. These mini-schemes make the security proofs much simpler to understand. It's a quantum money scheme that handles just one unit of currency. It's very easy to analyze and very easy to describe. And then we can combine the mini scheme with the digital signature scheme to get a full quantum money system. We can get a very nice and simple security reduction, which shows that counterfeiting resistance can be proved. So here's the main part of previous works. I'm still just mentioning previous works here. Even if you have these so-called black box membership oracles, you can give them out to an attacker. Then the attacker or counterfeiter will still need at least 2 to the power of n over 4 quantum curious to these oracles to be able to copy this quantum state with some success probability eta. So even if we give the attacker these oracles, we still need an exponential number of curious. So we have a complexity theoretic argument for making our money safe from counterfeiting. But now, this is a Bitcoin and cryptocurrency conference, so let's go from quantum banknotes to the real thing here, quantum Bitcoin. How do we remove the central bank? So again, private key quantum money, the bank creates and verifies. Public key quantum money, the bank can create and anybody can verify. What we want to do is anyone can create and anyone can verify. A distributed system in the same way we use in cryptocurrencies. Of course, we still must prevent runaway inflation. So let's make a first minting. See the problem that minting and mining are very similar words, but I hope I won't mispronounce them. So we have a minting system where we take the classical part of the quantum banknote and we store it in the blockchain. We store it in the same way we store a coin-based transaction. In Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, new currency is only created when a miner is successful in finding a block, right? So let's take this serial number and public key and put it in the blockchain just like Bitcoin. And then a verifier can verify that a given quantum banknote by reading off the blockchain, that is reading off the public key and the serial number, and verify it to the quantum state that he or she is given. So when we create new currency, the minter stores the public key and the serial number in the blockchain. And when we get this quantum Bitcoin to ourselves, we can read off the public key and the serial number and do the verification like before. This is our first attempt, and I will show you an attack later on. But let's just see what properties we can find from this first quantum Bitcoin proposal. Again, anyone can mint. Inflation is controlled since we can only create new units of currency in the same way that Bitcoin creates coin-based transactions or new units of currency. They need to win a proof of work lottery to get this valid money. Then transactions, since we just give away the quantum states physically or over the quantum network, we don't need to store the transactions in the blockchain. Again, counterfeiting resistance is from the quantum non-cloning theorem, and we can just store the new coins in the blockchain. So when I give you my quantum Bitcoin, you just read the blockchain. You don't need to write to it. And this is a major advantage. You don't need to write anything to the blockchain. Of course, you will have a much higher scalability in transactions. Total transactions per second is basically unlimited. All right? But there's a big problem with this first version, and that's something I call quantum double mining. When a minter creates the currency, we have this private key part that is part of the signature process. But the question is, how do we trust an untrusted miner to discard this private key after use? And of course, we cannot, because in the Bitcoin system, in a distributed system, we do not trust the minters individually. We can only trust them as a group, as long as a given, or as long as the number of honest nodes is greater than some probability. So this will be a major attack. Say that a malicious minter is successful in, I call it, canonizing the quantum Bitcoin. That is, submitted it and got it into the blockchain. Then this minter can sell the quantum Bitcoin like normal and just wait. And at any time then, the minter can take the private key and issue identical new quantum Bitcoin that will be indistinguishable from the first quantum Bitcoin. It's really hard to overstate the problem of this attack. If I am a malicious minter and I see that my quantum Bitcoin is used by, say, my political enemy, I can then just create thousands upon thousands of copies and devalue that person's currency. It can be really bad. So we must eliminate this double mining or double minting attack. In traditional quantum money, we use a trusted mint. But in quantum Bitcoin, we want to be able to trust the majority of minters, not individually. But since an individual person can hold the whole private key, we need to make this impossible. We need to distribute the task of minting to the honest majority. The ideal solution would be to have something called one-shot mining, that someone pushes a button, a quantum Bitcoin is created without even having to touch a private key. But this is probably impossible, since how you can make someone forget a key, or how can you make a process that's one way without having any kind of private key to remember? Our solution instead is to make that no single entity has the complete private key. I mean, a blockchain solves every problem in the world, right? So 2 blockchains should solve every problem we have here. I'm joking. Okay, 2-stage mining. I call these quantum shards, and I realized also that quantum or blockchain sharding is also a concept. Don't confuse this with these quantum shards. The naming is a bit unfortunate, I agree. But let's make quantum shards. We make this minting process into a 2-step process now. We create these quantum shards, again, serial number, quantum state, and the digital signature. And then we can sell this on some kind of marketplace. And now we have a quantum Bitcoin miner. So we have a quantum shard miner, which can be one person, and the quantum Bitcoin miner can be the same or some other person, can combine these shards into quantum Bitcoins and sign the whole thing. So we crush them into pieces, we build them together. And these shards have an expiry time T-max. So unless these shards are combined into a real quantum Bitcoin after T-max, they will expire and lose their value. And the thing is here that if an attacker controls at most 15% of the computing power, let's assume we use proof of work, then we can show that the double mining probability is proportional to 2 to the power of minus m. So we can make this probability of double mining attack very, very small, exponentially small. Again, m is the number of shards we need in a quantum Bitcoin. So this is a security parameter we choose when we create our currency. So this will be a complete quantum Bitcoin now. We have first serial number, first quantum state, and first signature. This is the first shard. The second shard, and so on. We have m shards, and then we have a signature for all of it. So the signature combines serial number 1, 2, 3, and so on, and signatures 1, 2, 3, and so on into a big signature with its own key. So here we have one private key, one private key, one private key, and then an extra private key. So there are many private keys now. And the thing is, with a very high probability, we will not have a single entity controlling all of these keys at once. So So let's look at the verification algorithm, which means that if I get this thing, this big quantum Bitcoin, I will first look up the public key for the whole quantum Bitcoin, which is sigma 0. And I can verify that all these serial numbers match the signature. I can look up the public key for each shard because they're in a blockchain, the second blockchain. And then we can verify the individual signatures. And then we do the quantum part and verify the individual quantum states. And this is how it works. We can identify some properties of these quantum Bitcoin. Transactions, again, are instant and, I quote unquote, free. Of course, it won't be free because we need to build a quantum network, but free from the eyes of the protocol. There's no paper trail. This currency will be anonymous, which can be good or bad depending on your viewpoint. It requires a quantum network. It also requires quantum technology to be much further than we are today. On the image to the right is a typical quantum computer, or the insides of a quantum computer. You put this whole thing down in a vacuum flask, a cryogenic bottle, cool it to, say, 100 microkelvin, and then it might work. Very, very difficult and not really available today. We can also have scalable transaction volume, as I said, no paper trail. You don't need to record the transactions in a blockchain, so you can do this with an infinite scalability with transactions. But again, technology is not available, and we still have basically only black box security. Again, we have some explicit methods for implementing these black boxes, not theory or multivariate polynomials added with noise, but the security of this is not really known yet. However, mining is classical. You generate serial numbers and signatures classically. You can do that already today. So get started mining quantum Bitcoin, and whenever we can make quantum Bitcoin for real with experimental technology, you can sell those on the already stored market. Okay, these things are still a bit science fiction, I will admit, but the theory seems decently sound enough. I will just summarize a few main points. The no cloning theorem is a double spend prevention given to us by nature. We should try to use it. This is one example of it. And quantum Bitcoin uses these quantum money states and record their descriptions in a blockchain. And counterfeiting resistance and double mining resistance are shown. Okay, so I think that's enough for now. I will welcome your questions, and I'll be here all week to discuss further on. Thank you.
Yeah. So any questions to him? Yeah, please go ahead. You're next.
Your idea is very interesting. How far off from now do you predict that will be happening?
Decades, at least. I'm a bit of a skepticist regarding quantum computing. Many people say it's 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. I'd say it's longer.
Yeah, go ahead. You first.
Where does the 15% threshold come from?
The 15% threshold is a consequence of calculations. All the details are in the paper. It's much lower a threshold than in other cryptocurrencies, but it's just a fact of how the theorem looks.
Two questions. How is the mining performed, and what is your take about quantum proof of stake? Because that would be a very interesting, at least, research topic, right?
So quantum proof of stake, I haven't looked into it myself. Have you heard anything about it? That's a new topic for me.
I do give future direction over here.
Okay, yeah, sure. No, I haven't looked into quantum proof of stake, but sure, why not look at it? For the first part, you asked how the mining works, and I mean, it's just like a normal blockchain. You just record classical data, serial numbers and digital signatures in, say, a coin-based transaction. Instead of creating a transaction from nothing to yourself, you record some other data, like these serial numbers, just like any normal blockchain.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. And there is one.
Thank you for the talk. Since I see that you can have an increasing number of private keys to verify stuff. Have you ever considered the use of hash-based signatures to speed up the verification process, like, for example, the use in IOTA?
Well, you can use any digital signature algorithm. This proposal is agnostic to which ones that can be used. If you use this hash-based, you can make them quantum safe, which is pretty nice. But
That's partially also
doesn't really matter. You can use anyone you want.
One last question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. One part of the question is like, how would a wallet look like if I want to pay? And secondly, can I split this currency? Because if I cannot split it, it seems quite impractical.
So the presenter can prepare.
Yes, at the Mesa there is an issue here, so we can't really split the currency into smaller parts as of now. It's an open question at the end of the paper, basically. And sorry, your first question again? Oh yeah, a wallet would be a physical wallet. With the current technology, we would be basically storing cryogenic bottles at 100 millikelvin with the quantum states, like a photon stored in a specific polarization. You probably think of software here, but you have to think of hardware instead. Hardware wallets, they're pretty in, so I guess that's a good thing.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. And
thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, now welcome him, with a big applause.
Wait.
Shenbi, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. The title for my paper is A Solution for the Risk of Non-deterministic Transactions in Hyperledger Fabric. And I introduced myself briefly. I am a researcher for the company of Fujitsu R&D Center. I work in Suzhou laboratory in China, and now I will introduce my paper. This is my outline. First, I will introduce the framework for Hyperledger Fabric, and second, I will introduce the risk for non-deterministic transactions. Third, I will propose our solution to solve this problem. At last, I will do some discussion and future work. This is the framework for Hyperledger Fabric. I will introduce it briefly. When one transaction is invoked, and the transaction is submitted to the Fabric network. First, we will submit transaction to endorsing peer. We'll send the transaction to endorsing peer, and the endorsing peer will execute chain code and return the result, which contains read set and write set, and return the result back to the client. Then client will send the transaction proposal to the ordering service. At last, after ordering service producing blocks, and it will deliver the transactions to all the peers. This is the life cycle for Hyperledger Fabric. And during this process, we think there are two problems. The first is read-write conflict. Transactions may be invalidated due to read-write conflict, which can decrease the network performance. And the second, the transaction order may be disrupted during the ordering service. So at last, the transaction order may be inconsistent with the submitting order. Next, I will introduce these two problems in detail. The first is read-write conflict. As we know, when large number of transactions are sent to Fabric network concurrently, if a transaction operates the same key, and then the MVCC will occur, and some transactions will be defined as invalid. Think about this one scenario. When one company invokes transfer transactions to pay salary for many staffs at the same time, and as the picture shows, at the first, transaction 1 and transaction 2, they read the key for K1, and at this time, the version for K1 is the version 1. And after ordering and committing, at last, transaction 1 is committing to the ledger earlier than transaction 2. And at that time, the version of K1 is updated to version 2. But transaction 2 finds that now the version of K1 which is saved in the ledger state is different from the endorsing result. So at that time, transaction 2 will be defined as invalid. So this is the read-write conflict. And the second problem is transactions order dependency. So think about this problem. If we send the transactions based on the order, transaction 1, transaction 2, and after endorsing, ordering, and committing, maybe the ordering is disrupted because of two scenarios. The first is it may be caused by network delay and a different chain code execution time on peers. For example, when we send transaction 1 earlier than transaction 2, but because the network delay exists and maybe different peers cost different time to execute chain code, so the returning order may be disrupted. And the second scenario is some misbehavior ordering node may break the transactions receiving order, such as PPFT algorithm. So next, I will take an example to show this problem. Think about in one car, we can use a vehicle decentralized app to record the car's speed sensor into the fabric ledger. So if the transactions order is disrupted, so the final transactions order committed on the fabric ledger can't reflect the actual trend of car speed. So in order to solve this problem, we design one cache layer on Fabric DAPP client. We use a cache queue service between the Fabric SDK and the ordering service. So when client submits transactions to Fabric network, first we put these transactions into a cache queue. And in this cache queue, we analyze the read-write conflict between these transactions. If one transaction conflicts with the previous transaction, which are already sent into ordering service, then we move this transaction into another conflict queue to make it wait until the conflict disappears. And another, we use real-time sorting service for cache queue. So we can keep the transactions order in the cache queue is the same as the submission order. And we also select use Kafka as a consensus algorithm which can't change the transaction order. And this is the example for cache queue service. Suppose there are 5 transactions. At first, we put all these 5 transactions into cache queue. So now we find transaction 1 and transaction 2. Their read key set is empty, and they don't conflict with any previous transactions. So we send them to ordering service directly. But when we process transaction 3, such as the table shows, we find transaction 3 conflict with transaction 2 because it reads the key of K2, which is written by transaction 2. So at that time, the risk exists that read-write conflict may happen. So we make the transaction 3 when waiting and move it into conflict queue. by the same way, we move the transaction 4 and 5 into a conflict queue. So after a while, when transaction 1 is committed, and it will notify the conflict queue. And at this time, we find the conflict disappear, and we can remove transaction 4 from conflict queue. By this method, at last, we can solve all of the 5 transactions, and they will be all saved on the ledger, and MVCC error will not happen. In order to verify our method, we do some experiment to evaluate the performance. Our experiment environment is that we build 4 peer nodes, which include one endorsing peer, and we also use one order node. We use Solo as a consensus algorithm, and set block time as 1 second, and set max block size as 5 transactions. Our experiment scenario is transfer money from one account to another account. If 2 transactions contain the same account, then RW conflict will happen. And the request transaction account is 200. We defined the conflict rate as the percentage of conflict transactions in total submitted transactions. And this is the transfer chain code, which is be used in our experiment. We'll also use throughput to test the performance. After experiment, we also compare them between some different solutions. There are 5 solutions to solve the problem of read-write conflict. First is some researchers proposed we can submit transactions at a fixed time interval to make sure conflict will not happen. But in this way, it don't support concurrent transactions, and the time interval is hard to determine. And the second is to monitor the transactions. When we submit transactions, we monitor whether the previous transaction is committed successfully by event hub. And the third is we place first in and first out queue between business logic and Fabric SDK. But this method will produce a large number of invalid transactions. And the fourth method is we change the chain code to use no duplicate keys. This method is very effective, but this method needs the developer to change the chain code every time. We think it's very impractical. And our solution by Casper layer, we do not modify any chain code, and our performance is better than other solutions at most situations. This is the performance evaluation between different read-write conflict solutions. As the picture shows, we can see that when conflict rate gets higher and higher, cache solution is better than other methods. But at higher conflict rate, no duplicate keys method performs better than our solution. But I think this method is not suitable for most of the situation because it needs a developer to modify chain code, and it can't solve overspending. At last, I will state that there are still some limitations in our cache solutions. First, now currently we only implement the cache layer on client side. In future, we may implement it in global side, we will think about how to implement this method. And we will also evaluate the risk for transaction order dependency, because in some scenario, there are no effects for DAPP, although the problem of TOD may make the final transactions order non-deterministic. So in future, we will also do some work for this solution. First is we will test our solution whether it is effective on various environments, because we only test our solution on one single server. And next, we will think about how to implement the global cache layer. At last, we think we can deploy the cache queue service as a pluggable module, because in some scenarios, maybe developer don't need this method, so we can deploy it as a plug module. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah. You first.
There are some application scenarios where reordering of transactions might be considered highly undesirable, like sort of exchanges that are subject to regulatory requirements to fairness in the order in which they treat transactions. Have you thought about the impact of what you're doing on that sort of application?
Can you say it again? Which?
I'm just thinking if I'm doing an exchange, for example, right, then the order in which transactions are handled, right, can be subject to regulatory requirements that you sort of be fair to people in the way that you order the transactions.
You say the transactions order maybe we don't need to care the transaction order.
I mean, it's just that I think there's scenarios where you would be sort of breaking the rules of the application if you reordered transactions.
Oh, you mean think about the scenario? So we think in our method we only consider in some scenario we will use this method to keep the transactions order consistent with the submitting order, such as sometimes we need to keep the ledger value reflect the actual trend of some data sequence. So in that scenario, we will use this method, and in other scenario, we can remove this ordering service.
Yeah. Okay. So this is kind of sort of a delicate question. So let's finish our question session with you. You know the.
So after you have the conflict resolved and the transaction gets out of the conflict cache, how do you handle the resubmission to the endorser? So, because you need to re-execute the transaction to get a new key version. So how do you handle that?
Okay. I'll look at. So first, when we find a conflict happens, so at that time we will put transaction 3 and 4, 5 into a conflict queue, and then we have deployed a transaction listener to monitor whether the transaction 1 is committed. When we monitor that transaction 1 is committed, and we will notify the conflict queue. And at this time, we will, because the transaction 1 has write key for K1, right? So at this time, we will search the conflict queue for these transactions to check whether there are transactions whose real key is K1, and we find the transaction 4. It has the real key K1. So at this time, we will send a transaction 4 to endorsing and repeat to endorse again. Yes.
Yeah, I think still there are some delicate issues. Like he mentions, sort of reordering. The ordering is not retained here. So and also the resubmitting is also another issue. So why don't we continue the talk after on the floor? Okay. So let's have a nice lunch and then let's finish our session. Thank you so much. Yeah.